Well, I guess quickly to introduce myself, I'm David Shipley. These days I'm a writer and an academic, and I speak on prison issues. I'm researching the experience of children who have a parent in prison, and I'm using collaborative storytelling research techniques to try and unlock their narratives in a more creative way than the traditional sort of semi-structured interview. But I wasn't always in academia. So about 10 years ago, I was working in investment banking, and I did something very dishonest and stupid. I lied to a prospective business partner. I committed a fraud, and subsequently, 4 years later, the police got in touch with me. I confessed when I went to court and I pled guilty, and in early 2020, I was sent to prison. I spent most of 2020 and 2021 in two different prisons here in England, and I guess in that environment, I found it in lots of cases a very traumatizing, horrible environment, and I became very radicalized about the prison system and the justice system and the harm it does. And now I dedicate my efforts to trying to overturn that. Before I come on to my talk, actually, I was going to touch on something Steve said, so that there's this sort of experience of PTSD from environments like this. Right at the end of my prison sentence, I became good friends with an old soldier. He had done 20 plus years in the British Army, had served in Iraq and Afghanistan, and he'd then committed a crime and was in prison. And he and I were going for a run around the grounds of the open prison we were in at the end. And I was saying to him, what's it been like? And he said, it's strange. It's the only thing I can compare it to is like being deployed to a war zone, because it's this experience where time stretches and compresses. It's very, lots of kind of not much happening, then sudden experiences of terror. And I feel like it's this experience that no one who will understand unless they've been here. And I think there are some interesting threads of similarity between the experience of imprisonment and the experience of war, with the big obvious difference that generally we valorize quite naturally soldiers who've served, whereas prison is associated with shameful activities. Those of us who went to prison typically went there because we broke society's rules, and therefore I think we can often experience a kind of what Doak calls disenfranchised grief, this idea where we want to be able to grieve and experience of this process of grieving for the experience, but because it's shameful, you have to hide that. It's wrapped. And I think a lot of why prison can sort of instantiate these forms of CPTSD is that you get a lot of powerlessness in prison. You have agency taken away. You're locked in a cell. You're locked behind bars. You're locked behind walls. Very powerless. Dangerous things happen that you can't escape. You can't leave the environment. You see suffering, you see death, you see people in different kinds of misery. So it's quite natural that CPTSD develops in prisoners. And for me, Warhammer, both within prison and then since my release, became an important tool for managing my experience. But actually, I discovered Warhammer decades before. I was an 11-year-old boy. It was the autumn of 1993. I was staying at my grandparents' house, and my grandfather was dying. He'd come home from hospital. He had really bad melanoma. There was nothing they could do, and we were just waiting weeks at my grandparents' house for him to die. But this was a tough experience for an 11-year-old boy. I hadn't really experienced death before. I was waiting for the dying. Felt very heavy. The atmosphere in the house was difficult. No one really knew when he would die or how many days or weeks he would live, all sitting there waiting. And I remember one day my mother and I walked out to the local store, and we saw a magazine called White Dwarf. I'd never heard of before, but it had this incredible scene. It's they had what it was, the cover of the second edition 40k box, which I shared in the WhatsApp group for some of you in there, of this blood angel, a captain shooting at some orcs. Incredible painting. And it came with a free Space Marine on the cover. And that was it. That was, for me, that was, I took that home and I read that magazine from cover to cover, and they were talking about the lore and the background of the story of 40k. And from that moment, I was captivated. And I think it came at a really powerful time, because in those days and weeks, it became a place for me to escape to. I was discovering this whole new imagined future world of horrors and mysteries and strangeness. And that was a place I could escape to not be in this very real house, with all the the sadness around my grandmother waiting for her husband to die, my father and his sister waiting for their father to die, you know. And I played Warhammer after that all through my kind of childhood and through my teens. Then as I entered young adulthood, I got more interested in going out to party and going to work and all these sorts of things in university. And the models got put away in my parents' attic, and I kind of forgot about them until I was in prison. And I went to prison at the beginning of 2020. So initially, I think the day I arrived in prison, the news was talking about people being sent back, being flown back from China to get away from this coronavirus that was becoming a thing in the news. That's where to situate. And then within a couple of months, the lockdowns kicked in, and prison went from being a very limited space where we couldn't do much at all to becoming almost entirely limited. So in Britain, we locked down the prisons to the extent that we were all prisoners spending 23 or more hours every day in our cells. And that was incredibly tough. And I think with so little freedom and so much monotony, and in an environment where there's almost no sensory variety, it was very psychologically hard for all of us. I think that lack of sensory variety is a really important thread. You're in a space which is concrete and steel and iron, and there's nothing natural, nothing beautiful. All the cells are the same, and the only variety is what kinds of dark stains and what kinds of graffiti are on the walls, and where your bed is broken or where the desk is broken. And these cells are small as well. A typical British prison cell is about the size of a car parking space, and in that you have a bunk bed for two men, a sink, a toilet, a little table that you eat at, and a tiny amount of floor space. So this gives you an idea of how limited that environment felt. And you'll have, sort of barred window that you could peer out of and see usually more buildings and maybe a wall if you were lucky, or a scrap of sky. And simultaneously, the environment is very assaulting. So the soundscape of prison is loud. There's shouts, there's screams, there's banging of heavy boots on concrete, on steel stairs, the gates slamming, jangling of chains, keys rattling. And if you're interested in that aspect, there's like Kate Herity writes brilliantly about this in her recent book. But I think there's something specific about prison, that you've got an environment which is simultaneously very unstimulating and incredibly overstimulating in quite an assaulting way, which is particular to the experience. So it's in this context that I managed to get the prison to let me have some Warhammer sent in. So because of COVID, in a humane gesture, they said we were allowed to get board games sent in. And I thought I'd chance this and see if I could get some Warhammer sent in. And it turned out they thought that counted as a board game. So great. I got myself some Astra Militarum, some Imperial Guard guys, and I had a box. Then I instantly ran into some problems, because the practical challenges of doing this hobby in prison are quite significant. So you're not allowed any kind of proper glue. It's the first one. So no plastic glue, no super glue, and nothing like that, and certainly no model knives. But the thing about prisons is we're very creative. So in almost every prison cell where people have been there a while, you'll see creative activities. And these creative practices for marginalized groups are a really consistent way in which people who've lost freedom, lost agency, assert agency and control over their environment. So people will draw pictures and stick them on their walls. They will assemble things. They'll get matchsticks and build incredibly complex models of ships, of things from the natural world. They'll create art. If they haven't got art materials, they'll use toothpaste as a form of paint to create artworks. And I think in this we see a couple of things. Firstly, it's a way of processing pain and trauma and grief, and the loss and the sense of being in prison in this terrible place. But also it's a way of personalizing these anonymous environments. And in prison, you feel very anonymous and very forgotten. And actually, in being able to take agency and take control just of yourself and make it distinctively yours, you take back some of that autonomy and that agency. And that's a very, very very significant and powerful thread of being creative practices in prison. But yeah, so I didn't have any proper glue. I didn't have any kind of modeling knives. I managed to. We were allowed nail clippers, so I disassembled some nail clippers and used them to like cut the models out of the sprues and very gently take the modeling lines off. And we were allowed PVA glue, so kind of like a wood glue. And I don't know if anyone has. I imagine no one has ever tried to stick Citadel miniatures together or any miniatures together with wood glue. And I wouldn't recommend it because it takes forever to dry. You sort of have to hold these two parts together and just wait, maybe 10, 15 minutes before you've got a strong enough bond, which, is a challenge. But interestingly, less of a challenge in prison, because I think the thing is when you're in prison and there's nothing to do and it's COVID, and I was in a situation and I had 23 hours a day to kill in my cell, actually holding those pieces together for 15 minutes until they dried was fine. And I even managed to do some quite big models. I got hold of a Thunderhawk gunship at one point and was able to build that, and even a Baneblade, which took an astonishingly long time to build. I cannot begin. I do not even know. Probably 100 hours to assemble that Baneblade. But I was eventually able to build these things, and there were, it was tough because even the lighting in prison is bad. You have sort of a single strip fluorescent lights, so not great light. So when I finally managed to get some paints through slightly nefarious means through the prison black market, I was painting them. And that was challenging, just taking my time to paint. But again, because of this huge amount of time, I think I actually learned to paint miniatures decently for the first time in prison because there was no need to hurry. There was no rush. And I think often when we're doing the hobby in adult life, we have work commitments, we have family commitments, we have all these other demands on our time. And actually, without any of that, I was able to really focus on the hobby in a way I never had before. And I became much more invested in doing it slowly, not trying to rush the assembly or rush the painting, but just taking my time and doing it well. So that became a different sort of experience for me. And during my time in prison, what did I get from it? I think I found it very calming. The noise might be going on outside, but when I focused in and I assembled the pieces, cut them from the frame and assembled them, and then I looked down, and after 3 hours, I might have a handful of soldiers that I built. I felt calm. I felt a sense of focus. I was distracted. The time passed. But I think also I felt this sense of creating something and of progress. I was able to produce something, and I would, at the end of the day, I would look down and think, okay, well, nothing else good has happened today, but I've built a squad of Cadians. That's something. And I think that feeling of achieving something in an environment where you can achieve almost nothing is really, really good. And it was really, very powerful for me. And I think finally there was this aspect of escape. So, I still do this now. I always have. When I build each model, I like to give them a story, and particularly with the older ones that aren't monopose, I think you can slightly pose them in different ways. And each model has a story, and each model has a backstory, and there's something he's communicating in the way he's built. And for me, that allowed me to escape the prison I was in and step into an imagined world. And I actually managed to play a bit as well. My cellmate then decided he was into these things. He started to get some Space Marines, so we built them. And on our tiny table, we had to come up, we didn't have any balance points or anything, so we had to come up with strange narrative games squeezed in on a table that was about a foot wide, about 3 foot long. So very, very narrow battlefields, not much flanking going on. We still, it was still fun, and it distracted us, and it made things better. And what was interesting to me as well, actually, as lockdown started to ease a bit, other guys on the wing became aware that I was doing this. People could see them in my cell, and suddenly it was this thing of interest. Other people wanted them, and but soon there were 2, 3, 4, 5 other guys on the wing who were collecting Warhammer and painting them. And one guy got really into the Death Guard, and another guy got a load of Tyranids. And these were not men I think who'd ever encountered this hobby, because it's an expensive hobby, as I think we know, and it's not I think it probably is less pursued typically by people of low socioeconomic groups, which most people in prison are. I think certainly in the UK it's a very white hobby. And what was interesting is that these men who were of Black and minority ethnic groups, often low socioeconomic backgrounds, were suddenly really interested in this hobby, and we I think we're all getting these very similar experiences from this sense of fun, this control, this escape. And that I think was fascinating to me, to see how Warhammer could actually do wonderful things for lots of guys who would never have encountered in other situations. Then, of course, because you can't have too much fun in prison, I think they realised there were too many of us with these models, and they would decide this couldn't be allowed because it was too much fun, and so we were all banned from having any more sent in, and so we were limited then. There were no growth to our armies, but even then, I think it made a big difference. Since prison, actually, what's interesting is I find when I have PTSD from prison, in some sense triggered, I will return to sitting quietly and building and painting in moments where that trauma has re-emerged and been reawakened, and sitting in my house quietly, while my daughter's asleep, my dog's asleep. I just get exactly the same thing, a sense of calm, a sense of focus, a distraction, and an escape from what I'm feeling into a space where I'm soothed. And I think, reflecting back, in some ways, Warhammer has always been that for me. From the first time I encountered it with my grandfather, it's been a way of soothing a troubled, fearful heart and soul, and of sort of managing that trauma. And I think, particularly for me as well, the models I painted in prison, I will share some of these on the group, are always going to be especially important to me, and they will always feel loved. I think I love them. So I hope that gives some insight into the experience of Warhammer as a hobby and